Welcome to Political Ideologies Lecture 3B. Here we have our first introduction to Plato's Republic, one of the most important works in political philosophy. A bust of Plato is on the left, and Aristotle's Politics. As you recall, Aristotle was one of the most significant students in Plato's academy. The original title of the Republic was in Greek politeia, meaning city-state governance. The book takes the place of a Socratic dialogue written in approximately 380 BC. It's one of the most influential works of philosophy and of political theory, and is Plato's best-known work. As we know, Plato was a student of Socrates and was profoundly influenced not only by his teachings, but by his trial and his subsequent death. In the Republic, we see the fictional character of Socrates engage in Socratic dialogue with various Athenians and foreigners. These dialogues discuss the meanings of justice and examine questions such as, is the just man happier than the unjust man? The entire Republic centers on a simple question. Is it always better to be just than to be unjust? The puzzles in Book 1 prepare this question for the rest of the text. As you read through the text, you'll see I've highlighted key parts of the text for you in yellow. These are the ones in which you especially need to concentrate. Book 1 of the Republic begins on a festive note as we see Socrates returning from a religious festival with Glaucon, who in real life was Plato, the author's older brother. Other cast of characters in this section of the Republic include Polemarchus, a wealthy philosopher and merchant, and his father Cephalus. Additionally, we're introduced to the character of Thrasymachus, a sophist of the day, whose bust you see here. Thrasymachus and Socrates get into many arguments during this dialogue that reflect the conflicts I discussed between Socrates and the sophists of the day in Athens. Namely, sophists always took payment for their services, whereas Socrates believed that philosophical discussion should be engaged in for free and for the benefit of dialogue. In addition, Socrates believed that the end result of conversation should be a search for truth, whereas the sophists just believed in teaching their students skills for logical argument. Book 1 of the Republic, as you read, begins with a conversation about aging. Cephalus discusses that while many of his friends complain about old age and not being able to do things that are youthful, he thinks old age is less a burden than a relief from bodily desires. He knows this because he's been hanging out a lot with his friends and discussing these different issues. He states, "Men of my age flock together, we're birds of a feather," thus the origin of the phrase, birds of a feather flock together. Socrates says, well, Cephalus, that's easy for you to say, since you have the luxury of being wealthy. Other people might be less comfortable in old age if they didn't have as much money. Socrates then asks Cephalus if he inherited his money on his own, or made it on his own. He asks this because he presumes that people who inherit money are not as fond of it as those who make it themselves, i.e. those who inherit money might be more likely to waste it. It's obvious to Socrates that Cephalus is not overly fond of money. Cephalus admits that he did inherit most of his fortune, and then he goes on to answer Socrates' question about what the greatest good he's enjoyed from being rich. He says when a man reaches old age, he begins to think of all the injustice he's done in his life, and he starts to worry about dying and being punished for these injustices. Thus, he says, for reasonable men, the greatest value of wealth is that it keeps them from avoiding cheating or lying. Wealth keeps men from having to live life in the fear of owing debts to men or sacrifices to the gods. In response, Socrates begins to question Cephalus about ideas of justice. He asks whether justice is something as simple as telling the truth and returning what you receive. Thus begins conversations on justice that will take place through the rest of Book 1 of the Republic. Key questions of what is justice arise in different places in the Republic. On pages 4 to 5, we see this first conversation between Cephalus and Socrates. Is justice as simple as telling the truth and then returning your debts? Socrates offers the following example to prove his point that justice may not be as simple as this. If a person receives a weapon from their friend, and their friend then becomes crazy, would it be just to give that weapon back to the friend if he asked for it back? In this case, what would justice be? Giving a weapon or not? This question introduces us to the idea of Socratic dialogue, and it sets up a debate about justice and injustice that takes up the remainder of the book. As a reminder, key points of this reading will be highlighted for you to look at as you read the text. In the next part of the dialogue, we see Cephalus going off to prepare sacrifice for the festival and his son taking over the conversation about whether justice indeed is giving people their due. On pages 5 through 7 of the handout that is posted on Blackboard, we move from this idea of justice as telling truth and returning debts to the idea that justice is the art which gives good to friends and evil to enemies. After this conversation, the conversation regarding justice takes up again with the entrance of the sophist Thrasymachus, who is clearly frustrated with this Socratic argumentation that's gone on in Book 1. Socrates tells Thrasymachus, "Don't be so frustrated. Men spend a long time searching for gold in their lives. It makes sense that they would spend even longer searching for something more valuable than gold, justice." This incenses Thrasymachus more. He finally agrees to speak about what he thinks justice is if Socrates will pay him, but of course Socrates has no money. At this point, Glaucon, Plato's brother, jumps in and says the others will contribute to the cost if Thrasymachus will agree to speak. Thrasymachus then consents and tells us justice is the interest of the stronger. Thrasymachus asks Socrates for praise for this statement, but Socrates first wants to understand exactly what this means. First, Socrates establishes that justice is what the stronger thinks is to his advantage, rather than what may actually be to the stronger's advantage. Socrates then tries to establish that no ruler rules for his own advantage, but rules for that of his subjects, thus the parable of the sheep and shepherd that are introduced in Book 1. Having heard his words turned around, Thrasymachus becomes angry, and then states that in any partnership it's the unjust person who always gets the better of the just in every way. I ask you to question in your own lives as you read this dialogue whether indeed you agree more with Thrasymachus or with Socrates during this conversation. Although Thrasymachus wants to leave by this point, Socrates doesn't let him go until finally they talk about leadership. What makes the best men, and I say women as well, choose to rule? To this we see Socrates answering that the best men rule because it is better for them to rule than to wait for the ruling position to be thrust upon them. If a good man chooses not to rule, he then will have to be ruled by an inferior, and that is unacceptable. Thus, both fear and necessity forced men to rule through no benefit of their own. We next move on to a brief discussion of Aristotle's Politics. Politics basically investigates how people live in political communities. It's a study of the nature of states and a theoretical exploration of the form of the best possible state and of citizenship. In Book 1, which is on Blackboard, we begin our political investigation with the question of what is a state. Aristotle here makes 3 claims. 1, man is a political animal. He has a natural impulse to associate with others. I've highlighted on page 3 of your handout where it is and why that Aristotle says this. In the next paragraph, Aristotle notes that the state exists as a result of these human impulses for association. And then it is the state that ensures that human beings in turn behave justly towards one another. He thirdly states that there are certain human faculties, like the ability to reason over matters of good and evil, and justice, which can only flourish in the context of political association. We see that Aristotle's ideal state here is not perfect. Women and slaves are not citizens, as he defines the term. In Part 2 of Book 1, we see an extensive discussion of the difference between the relationship between men and women, and men and slaves. In both cases, man is clearly superior. In Book 3 of Politics, we see Aristotle asking questions such as who is a citizen and what is the meaning of the term. This is one of the most important questions Aristotle asks in Politics. For, while all human beings are impelled towards the creation of communities, culminating in the ultimate political community of the state, not all human beings can be citizens of the state as described by Aristotle. I ask you to concentrate on what empirical evidence he provides to talk about citizenship, who he believes is a citizen in a democracy, and how a citizen is defined. He notes that different regimes will define citizens in different ways. Commonly speaking, however, he defines a citizen as a person whose parents are both citizens. This week I've also assigned some video clips for you from the birther movement, which looks at the issue of our current President Barack Obama and whether he is or is not a citizen as an important question of leadership. As you look at these, I ask you to think about the ideas proposed by Aristotle regarding who is a citizen and who is not a citizen, and to think about the way you yourself believe citizenship might be defined, or best defined, within a liberal democracy like ours. Thank you, and I look forward to speaking with you in Lecture 4.